Okay, so the gems of Europe, I split into two parts, and this is what we're going to do today. Starting from the south, Montenegro, Kotor Bay, Bosnia, Croatia, which we've seen the Plitvice lakes, but they're so beautiful, I threw them in again, and Slovenia and Germany. And so what I did was save the second part for Hungary and Budapest, because that ended up being about half of it, and it made it too long. So we're going to do that, I think, in October. So this is where we're going. The first four are in this area right here, which is the former Yugoslavia, beginning here down at the bottom and going into Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, these four. And the other two are up in this part of Germany. And of course, we'll come back to Hungary, as I said, another day. So beginning then in Kotor Bay, Montenegro, this was actually from two trips, in 2006 and 2009, where I did these, not all at the same time. So Kotor Bay is way down here at the bottom of your picture, and it's a little bit of a bay and a bay and a bay, as you'll see. Very close to Dubrovnik. It was a day trip from Dubrovnik. And the second one into Mostar was a day trip from the hiking trip, which you remember from 2009, which we were up in this area. And the Plitvice Lakes was with the first trip down here, as was these two. The ones in Germany were from the first trip as well. So a little bit about Kotor Bay. Actually, it's not actually one bay, it's two bays. It's or three or four. It's a bay, and then that bay has a bay, and that bay has a bay, and that bay has a bay going all the way down here. So it's actually not a bay, as you see in your text below. It's a ria, which is a submerged river canyon. So the river is running down into this end and basically made it into to a fjord or these series of bays. And so we stopped in two places, in Kotor Bay and then also down here, which we're going to see at a very special resort. So this was our day trip from Dubrovnik, going down the mountainous road. And of course, we had the Adriatic on this right side and the same mountains we saw in the hiking trip, the Biokovo Mountains. So the bay itself, or this trip around it, isn't all that big. It's a 67-mile shoreline all the way around, about 17 miles across the bays as the crow flies. So as we're coming around all these corners, this was the first glimpse we had of two islands that are just opposite Perast. Well, it's skipping on me a little bit. So here they are. The two islands are, one is the Lady of the Rocks Church and the other is a Benedictine monastery. The Lady of the Rocks Church is an interesting place because, as you would expect, there are a lot of fishermen in this area, being right on the Adriatic. And these fishermen had a miraculous experience at one point and wanted to thank the lady for doing that, and began a 100-year project to make an island out in the middle of this bay. So every time they go out to fish, they throw some rocks in, until over a 100-year period, they had enough rocks to make a little island and build this church. Now that's perseverance for you. The grandchildren or the great-grandchildren may have been the ones to actually see that church being built. And the Benedictine monastery you see is down here. So we stopped at each of those two. Right now we're on the Benedictine one, looking over to the other one. And the Benedictine monastery is a little bit fancier than the Lady of the Rocks. You'll see this is kind of like your homemade church, but this is the little pier place where you can pull in a boat at the Benedictine monastery. And
so that monastery actually was on an existing island? Yes. It was not a self-created island.
It's on a real island. It's on a real island. So this is the interior of the Lady of the Rock Church, and it's kind of homemade. It has a little museum that has homemade things in it, but this is like red velour and little knickknacks from what you might even see in a house. It does have a lot of pictures and has a very nice ceiling, however. But some of these handmade handmade items, they're pictures and sculptures and handmade scarves and things like that that are in this church. It's a fisherman's church. So this is the town of Perast, and the whole bay, however, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I said these mountains are the same ones we were hiking through up a little farther north. the Bikovo Mountains. But it's well preserved, and you see the stone houses and red tile roofs, just like we've been seeing all through Croatia. Little winding streets, some beautiful pictures, of course, with the mountains and the kind of architecture that they have. These buildings go back a couple of hundred years, and as you'll see lots of fishing boats and boats out in the bay. They also grow scallops in that bay, and they look like this. They're lines that are dropped down in the water, and the scallops attached to them. When they get big enough, they pull them up, and that's where your scallops come from. So this is the very end of the bay, and at Kotor, the other town that we were talking about. The little folks who are welcoming you to Kotor in English. A very small town, but it's been there for thousands of years. Probably all this area has been from preceding even the Romans and Greeks, owned by different countries. And so I won't go into all of that history, but there is a history from the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians and all of them. So this one is an Orthodox church that's right in the square. There are more Orthodox than Catholics in Kotor and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In Herzegovina, in Montenegro and Herzegovina, but pretty evenly divided. A few more Orthodox. The Orthodox churches, you'll see the icons all over of the different saints. So that's common to see those. The narrow streets, of course, and the Kotor had a long naval history, lots of invaders, as I said, in which case they built a wall back, as many of them did during the Venetian period, which would be about 1400. And some of that wall still exists, and you can see it kind of snake up the mountains here. Reminds me of the Great Wall of China in places. So our bus is now has come around these bays, and we're heading over this way. And where we're headed to is St. Stephen's Island, which is a 5-star hotel. They made a little causeway out to it so that you have a little beach, but it was an island with real rocks. And the hotel is a hotel plus all these little cottages that you can rent. Svetisteban would be how you pronounce it in Croatian or whatever they're speaking there. So you can see some visitors coming up, but you might have a little patio like that in your own little cottage. I think it's quite pricey, as I remember, but it's very secluded. So if you're interested in a secluded, pricey place, St. Stephen's was very nice. We had lunch there in the hotel, which was very good, and of course, beautiful views. So we're leaving Herzegovina and Montenegro right now and going on to Bosnia. Bosnia is mainly a Muslim country. All these countries are a little bit different. So when they split up, many of the people who had moved around moved back to where they were from originally. So Bosnia has only a small part to the sea. In fact, this is exaggerated. It is, you can see across it. It's extremely small, so that they have some outlet to the sea. So where we were hiking was right up in here. And we did take a day tour over with other people who were staying in the town. The name Mostar comes from Mostari, which means bridge keeper. And as you'll see that there is a river running through it. And that river became very important. It divided the city. One point, the Christians lived on this side and the Muslims on this side. So it was a divided city, became more so during after the war where they were bombed by Serbia. You remember that Dubrovnik was bombed by Serbia during the war, where after Yugoslavia split up, Serbia wanted to reunite it as Serbia, all Serbia. That didn't work too well, but they bombed the UNESCO city of Dubrovnik, and they also bombed this beautiful bridge that was a showpiece of Mostar. So they split more and more because of this divide and allegiance to Serbia or not. Here, the biggest tower we see on the Christian side is the Franciscan monastery of Peter and Paul, but you also see a minaret for a mosque As we drove down the streets, this was in 2009, and the war was in 2001 and 2 in this area. So you could still see bombed out buildings. That was very common. Not everything had been rebuilt even at that time. Perhaps that has changed somewhat. So this is the iconic bridge that was bombed, and you can see that it's been rebuilt. There are not all these pockmarks from bullet holes. So it was built by 2004. I mean, people were just aghast that Serbia would come and bomb this absolutely gorgeous site, which had been there for hundreds of years, as was the case also with Dubrovnik, both UNESCO sites. And a lot of money was poured in that to rebuild that as soon as possible after the war. So walking through town, then we walked through the town on the Christian side and then came over to the bridge. On the Christian side, there's this little bridge called the Sloping Bridge, which was built as a prototype for the larger one. So they did a practice one, and these were the Ottomans. Excuse me. It's late in the day. My allergies are bothering me. It's late in the day. This happens. So the Ottomans built this as a prototype to build this bigger one, large that we just saw just later on. They were trying out this arch. So this was the first one then, built by the Ottomans, and we got to walk through some of the areas of shops. This is Ruth, that you may remember from our hiking trip. Ruth and Olga and Teresa and I were the four who came from our group of hikers. So we came through some of the shops, very colorful stuff, particularly their fabrics were very nice, and a lot of rugs and scarves and woven things. So if you needed a colorful rug, this was definitely the place to get it. This is the most famous mosque in Mostar on the Muslim side. So one of the things we visited was one of the original mosques, which is this one. They date from the 16th and 17th century, but several of them were bombed during this war, which was really a shame. They're not all there anymore. This being next to this little altar place where the imam would come up and say the prayers and lead the discussion. And back there was a cemetery. I was intrigued with the little knobs on top. I'm not sure what the significance of those are. The second thing we visited on the Muslim side was this visit to a Turkish house, a typical Turkish house from way back. And I found it quite interesting as well. This is outside on the doorstep, built of stone, of course. And inside was whitewashed, but very plain and plain walls. But what you would see was a combination living and sleeping area as you looked around the room, the several rooms. And they had some clothes up on the wall as samples of what people wore. So there were plenty of restaurants. We did have lunch in Mostar, right by the bridge where we had a nice view of the Stari Grad, the old bridge. So here we are at our table. You can see the bridge from the table. So there was restoration, but as you see, not all of it was restored by 2009 when we were there.
So Mary, someone asked if Mostar was where all the cats were. Are you familiar? Oh no, Kotor. Kotor is where you see all the cats. I didn't
particularly notice them. That could be true, but I don't know. We weren't really there long enough, being on a tour, we just had a short stop. So okay. I can't answer that yes or no, really. So this is the Sava, I'm sorry, not the Sava River, the Rebte River. Sava is another town. So
the water looks beautiful.
Yes, it is. It's very pretty. Leaving Bosnia and going on to more water, the Plitvice lakes. And if you were with us for the second Croatian tour, not the hiking, but the second one, which was the lakes in Zagreb, you saw some of these. And I'm just doing repeat of them because there are not too many of them. This little diagram down below shows you the levels of the lakes. There are 16 that formed. Some are quite deep and some pretty shallow. They're just naturally formed on the Kotor River. And this is right at the border of Bosnia. And so there's a similar one on the Bosnia side. There are quite a few hotels, and we're able to stay overnight in one. Some tours miss it altogether, which is why I wanted to include it, especially as a gem, because a lot of tours to Croatia don't include it, which I think is a shame. It is a UNESCO site. It was the first national park in Croatia, but originally it did not have very good accessibility. And since then it's become more accessible and definitely worth visiting, and definitely staying overnight and doing 2 hikes, one to the upper lakes and one to the lower lakes. They each take several hours. So if you're only there at a quick stop, you can't really see all of it. So the water is from the runoff from these mountains, which is to be expected, of course. And what is different from when it first began is these walkways, these wooden walkways. As you can see, we're in a little bit of rain right there, but that made the park accessible. And there was a gift from a donor. So if you look down here at the bottom, you can see people, little tiny people, and this huge waterfall. Just gives you an idea of how big that waterfall is. This is the largest one in the park. But there really is just water everywhere. And as you're walking through, you just hear this rush of water, and everything smells so clean and fresh. You see how green everything is. Water was very clear. So this is over about a 5-mile walk if you did all of it in one time. So some of the waterfalls I say are pretty big, some smaller ones, over 73,000 acres. You hear the water very clear as well. So these were natural dams that created these lakes, and there's a lot of marshland around it with wildlife and birds and different animals. And there's one picture I didn't show the first time that I added this time. This was at the restaurant where we had dinner, and I typically don't like this sort of thing. I'm really turned off by stuffed animals. But anyway, this was in the local restaurant, just showing some of the wildlife that's in the area.
Mary, could you, someone had asked, what was the name of the national park with all the waterfalls?
It's called Plitvice Lakes.
Okay.
Plitvice.
Thank you.
Plitvice. Plitvice. Okay, we're moving on now to the most northerly of the Slavian countries that we're talking about, and this is in Slovenia. Again, lots of times Slovenia is off the charts because it's tucked in there between Austria and Croatia and Italy. But it's right up against the mountains. If you went over a little bit farther, you'd be seeing Switzerland. So these are the Julian Alps, so it's an extension of the Alpine country. And there are several parks up in that area. And the most popular, of course, is Lake Bled, which is very beautiful. And we also visited some caves in Postonia and the capital in Ljubljana. So this is the picture of Lake Bled with the beautiful St. Mary's Church, again on an island. That seemed to be a favorite thing to do with all these huge steps coming up and little boats that you take to get there. You also see in this picture a castle. And remember that just a little bit of history is these countries that we're talking about weren't really countries until recently, the last 100 years or so. And this applies to Germany and Austria as well. These were very fluid borders. There weren't developed countries. There were little kingdoms, little dukedoms, and so you have lots of castles with people who ruled just a small area. So if you want to go visit the church, which of course you want to do if you go to Lake Bled, you have to ride in one of these boats called a pletna. Now the story with the pletna is that Queen Maria Theresa of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who ruled Slovenia at that time, gave concessions to these boat owners that they would be the ones who could take people out to the church and nobody else. And this goes back to 1590. It's a long time. So that profession of taking people in these little pletnas is still in those same families that did it way back then. So you could get about 20 people in a boat and you had an oarsman and a rower. So they take you out. This is a beautiful picture from the castle on this clear day where we went to the castle and had this view of it. So you can see it really is an island. You can walk around this lake too. It's about 3.5 to 4 miles in a walk around. So coming up to the church, we are confronted with this row of steps, and here we are at the top of it, this lovely bell tower, which has a bell that you can ring. And it's very popular with weddings, but I was told that the custom is that if you're married in this church, the groom has to carry the bride to the top, which is 99 steps. Now, I don't know, if I were a groom, I think I'd balk at that, but that's what you're supposed to do. So the interior of the church is the gold Baroque, which is typical of that 1800s. Here is one of the people from our group who is ringing the bell, and you're supposed to ring the bell and make a wish that it will come true. But very fancy inside. It's a small church. And of course, on the other side, if you're looking the other direction, are a bunch of hotels where you can stay. It is a very popular tourist destination. We did visit the castle as well, which had been started many centuries ago, well, about 1,000 years ago, and added on to. And if your room didn't face the lake, you could have breakfast by the lake or lunch or whatever and have that view. So most of those hotels had some way that you had a nice view of the lake. So up at the castle, it is the oldest of the Slovenian castles. I said about 1,000 years when it first began. It does have its own winery, and it has a nice little museum with history of the area, with a nice coin collection of coins that go way back and other things, armor and things like that. And of course, it was added on to many times over its history. And moi, with the fuzzy hair at that time. Nice views in all directions, of course. Looking back over the town, there is a little town there. We did have a little bonus though. If it's too touristy at Lake Bled, you can go to Lake Boheen, which is very nearby. It's also in this national park about 30 miles away. And we did have a little trip up there. And it's much quieter than Lake Bled. Not so many people. Hiking trails, they have skiing in the wintertime, take a boat ride. So if you want to just kind of chill out and stop and smell the flowers, this is the place to go. There's lots of these kind of alpine types of hotels or little guest houses, but it's not overrun with tourists like the other. This is Treelof National Park. Also a pretty little church. These domes are typical of the Austrian and alpine architecture. If you're into rock climbing, you can do that there too. We had dinner in this little town in the evening. You see some of the decorative things on the houses, which is also typical of the alpine countries, and some of the traditional music. In the capital of Ljubljana, we also see some of the paintings on the walls, which are very pretty. We didn't have a chance to go up to the castle, but there is one. It was market day in the square. This is the main square in Ljubljana, a very, very nice town. If I were looking for best capital, I would probably say Ljubljana was my favorite of any of the European capitals. Very, very nice. There are 3 bridges because there are several rivers that flow through it, and it does flood. Ljubljanica and the Sava rivers run through and split right there, so they needed a triple bridge. And the pavement, of course, is from way back, the cobblestone pavement. And lots of this Baroque architecture that we saw a little bit ago. As you see, they do have a water level, but they do have flooding from time to time. And as the climate warms, I think that's going to be more and more of a problem in Ljubljana. Two of the old buildings in Ljubljana are the City Hall with its little clock on top. And this is the Franciscan Church of the Annunciation, a little bit old, less back in time, but very, very pretty inside. It was very dark, so I apologize for the poor picture quality. Best I could do with it. And in the square, lots of things to buy, some of the glassware and different crafts and local musicians singing. And I noticed the national dress was not quite as colorful as in some other countries, but we did have people there who were entertaining and selling things who were in national dress. Another lady here selling some of her pie, whatever that is. Looks like a pumpkin or a squash pie. I'm not sure what it was. And of course, lots of vegetables always in a local market. In our dinner that night, we had little music. Notice the portrait of the Pope on the wall. Tells you you're in a Catholic country. And we're leaving now Slovenia to go to Germany. Celle, Germany is a very small town. It's near in Hanover. This is Lower Saxony. Hanover is a large city, and Celle and Gifhorn are not very far away. They're pretty close, so it's easy to get to them. The Alte Rathaus, or the old house. It was one of these dukedoms, the ducal palace of Brunswick-Lüneburg. And it was built in 1292 and on, and from there, and there is a museum now in that building and also a theater. There's a lovely church in Celle. One of my favorites, in fact, not so much the Baroque architecture, which you do see here and in the fancy altar, but these lovely windows and trees. It gives it a nice airy feeling. There, maybe not to look at the art so much, but to sit down and contemplate a little bit. But it does have a lovely organ and some of the Baroque statuary at its entrance. And this would be modern Celle. And they do have some interesting sculptures here and there. This art, street art, the same one back and front. But that's not why you come to Celle. These are my hosts, Yvonne and Eric. Yvonne is American, but originally from the Netherlands. And she belonged to Friendship Force. And this is Eric from Hanover, actually Bergdorf, but he belongs to the Hanover Friendship Force Club. And they came to visit us. And since Yvonne spoke German, he stayed with her because he didn't speak English. Well, they ended up seeing each other again and again. And she ended up marrying him and moving to Germany. Eric is no longer with us, but I did stay with them a couple of times when I was in Europe. He was a lovely man, and Yvonne is back in the US now that he has died. It was also market day in Celle when we were there. So that the reason you come to Celle is because of this architecture. In a very old town, founded in 1248, as we see, and it has what we see here is this architecture that's similar to what you see in Shakespeare's town, the half-timbered in Alsace-Lorraine and much of Germany, the half-timbered buildings, which are stucco. These walls are made of like a haze stucco, and then with these wooden lats across to kind of hold the whole thing together. So they're very old, and I'm just amazed that they have stood the test of time. And as you see, there are many, many of them. I'm not going to show you all 400 of them, but there are just block after block after block of these houses. And I found them really just amazing and beautiful. And some of them they're all different, just one next to the other. And typically the shops will be below and people live in the upstairs part. Some of them do have when they were built or who the builder was. And I'll show you some of those as we go along too. but this is an interesting little street lamp. So here's one that was built in 1532. As I said, it was added on an upper story with the builder. The window boxes are very popular too in the Alpine countries, and as well as these fancy signs. And our next stop in
So Mary,
yes.
before we leave all that architecture, did did they keep the outsides the same, but has there been renovation and plumbing and, you know, modern things done inside?
They're probably, well, we didn't go in any of them. I'm sure they've been remodeled inside, but the outside in places like these historically important places, they do have to keep the outside like that. They couldn't put up, you know, a modern front, but they can.
No satellite dish.
Oh, no, nothing like that. You can't.
Thank goodness.
So they do try to keep these cities that are like this preserved. And you notice what good condition the buildings are in. And I'm always impressed with people who live in historical buildings or buildings that are really old. Rothenburg in Germany is another one that's similar to this, that has so many old buildings, but many buildings do. Even in our own East Coast, there's so many that preserve their buildings, and I'm just always impressed that people spend the time and money to do that. I think it's such a joy to see these buildings that people have cherished and lovingly taken care of. So the Windmill Museum also are buildings that have been preserved. A lot of the windmills, of course, are now the ones that we see, the big ugly ones, but these were very common all over the world, windmill and water mills. This one is close to Hanover as well. They come from all over. These were from the island of Mykonos, but for the most part, I did not take good enough notes to tell you where each one was from. They were very distinctive in style. See, this one even has the thatch roof. But they come mostly from Germany and the Netherlands, but they're from all over. They're from Spain and Mallorca and Japan and Korea. They're really just from all over the world. As you notice, these are probably from Asia somewhere. This one, I believe, was from Mallorca, if I remember right. Yeah, in Spanish one. And many of them have a place to live. This is Eric. So the miller was in charge of milling the grain that the farmers grew around. Most of them did live either nearby or right in the mill. See, some of these have like a little place underneath, a place to get in, have the house right with them. There's also a museum there where there are models of some of the ones that they didn't have in. These were moved from the spot where they were originally. And of course, these were some that they couldn't move or didn't move, but there are lots of them from all over the world. This was a lady from Mallorca. You see the little sign here. And some of these models were very interesting. Most of these German ones and Dutch ones have 4 of the blades, but other countries would have more than that. So it wasn't necessarily true that they all had 4 blades. This would have been a very ancient one with this kind of mill, and you see the grinding part. And how that was powered, I don't know. So this is the typical one with the 4 blades, and this was new to me, is that each of these blades tell the farmers when the mill is free. So if you live down a mile away, you could see this windmill. And if its windmill is straight up, that means it's free. But at different places where the blades are, it tells you what time it'll be free. And I don't remember all of that detail, but if you're looking down the road, you don't want to spend a couple hours sitting around with your horse and your buggy, that wagon full of grain if the miller's busy milling somebody else's grain. So that way you can tell when it's straight up again that the mill is free for you to go mill yours. And this is an interesting little blade. It's got 4, but it's kind of fancy. Eric on one of the water wheels, which is also another way to power your grinder. Another one, I think, from Korea. Water mill. One of the interesting things that happened, though, it's not just windmills. That there came a point where there were 2 churches in Russia who were tearing down a church, tearing them down, and just were looking for a place for them. This maypole has little windmills on it, which I thought were cute. If you're not familiar with the maypole, it has strings. On the 1st of May, you catch one of these strings and you dance around it. So many German towns have maypoles, but this one has little windmills on it too. And this is the museum and lunch spot, and you can have lunch outside. So these are the 2 Russian churches that were moved from Russia. And this one's kind of a log cabin, kind of more rustic one, and they're both Russian Orthodox. And again, this was a very dark one that I didn't even have a picture of, so I grabbed that one off the internet, and it was really dark. I did have to lighten that up quite a bit. And I thank whoever took that one. So this is going to be the end of our journey to these gems, and I hope that if you're in Europe again, that you have a chance to see some of them, because they're all definitely worth going to.
Well, they were beautiful. We do have quite a few questions that I did not actually interrupt you about. I'm going to start with the most current and just sort of go backwards. Stan and Sandra said, ask us. We need to ask them. So maybe we'll do that one last, about the inside of Paris buildings and Windmill Day. So at the end, before they share their screen, we'll do that. Is the national dress worn daily or just for special days?
No, I think for it's special occasion, or like market days, or for festivals and things like that. Most people dress just like we do all over. It's
okay. All right. We have that. Oh, did the Muslims immigrate there for asylum?
Immigrate to
that was from Gail.
Muslims lived in that country. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim. So that was there are lots of Muslim countries in that area. They didn't immigrate there recently. I mean, they were there to begin with. But when Islam first started.
Then there's a question from, did Slobodan Milosevic and Serbia suffer any repercussions for going to war with his neighboring countries?
I haven't really kept up with that. I know he was tried in an international court, and I'm not sure what he did with what happened to him with all that. Maybe somebody else knows that. You know, there was a lot of problems with Kosovo, and people being killed, and finding mass graves and things like that. So yeah, he was the leader of Serbia and was wanting to get the former Yugoslav countries back together under Serbian rule, and was really very vicious. I'm not sure if anything happened to him. Does anyone else know? I think that's a question for Mr. Google.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay, no. Oh no, those are just answers to something else. Okay. Oh, so then we have.
Well, there's a question.
Let's see, from Lanny. What time of year were you in Slovenia and Montenegro and Croatia areas?
Yeah, as I said, we were on two different trips, but I think both of them were in May, early May.
Okay.
The hiking trip was early May, and the trip to I'm sorry, the trip to Mostar was in Tuscela and Gifhorn were in May as part of that 2009 trip. The first were on the 2006 trip to Croatia, where I took extra day trips out to Kotor Bay. But then the pre-trip to our homestay in Zagreb was a 1-week tour of Croatia and Slovenia. So the others were part of that trip, but they were all in May.
So they are going late March and early April, I guess, of this next year, Lanny and Billy.
Are you? Well, you'll love it. That's all I can say. It's not as crowded that time of year. We didn't have huge crowds like they do have in summer, particularly these ones I'm talking about, like Bled, Dubrovnik, Mostar. They're pretty crowded in summertime. Because the Europeans like Croatia too, in that whole area. But going in spring or fall should be good.
Okay. Well, that's great. Does anybody else, you want to raise your hand if you have a question to Mary before we move on to other things? That was just beautiful pictures. Beautiful. I love water, any kind of water. So that was really, really nice, Mary. Thank you.
I apologize for my stopped up nose. I often get this way at the end of the day, and it's the ragweed's out. So what can I say?
Well, thank you for giving the presentation. I really appreciate that.
It's good to share these with you. It helps me not traveling to go back and look at these beautiful places and say, well, at least I've been somewhere.
Yeah.